Tourism and the climate crisis, probably two things we don't often think about together. Traveling is one of the most desired activities in modern society, while the climate crisis is that big elephant in the room we often don't like to think about or avoid thinking about. We usually think about tourism as this space of exception or disconnection to the day-to-day reality, but me as a tourism researcher, I will have to be that annoying person and remind you about how tourism is worsening the climate crisis and vice versa. But don't worry, I hope I can end my talk with some hopeful insights for the future. As I said, I'm a tourism researcher, and I've been worrying about the impacts of tourism for the environment and communities since my graduation. But back in those days, I would never imagine that I would have the chance to come to Germany and research about sustainable tourism, especially in a moment like this with a pandemic and lockdowns. As I navigated the crisis through the lens of a researcher, I could notice that the tourism sector was fighting for its survival, but there was also a debate rising from whether the recovery of the sector should be from a point of view of restarting the sector, meaning going back to the same formulas before, or reforming the sector, taking the opportunity of the pandemic to improve what was not working. So my questions started to be, how should tourism look like in a post-COVID world? And how can a sector so reliant on the movement of people reduce its impacts and its emissions? Maybe before jumping into these questions, it would be useful to have a look at how tourism was before the pandemic. So tourism has been, for the past 2 decades, one of the fastest growing sectors in the world. In 2019, we had 1.5 billion tourists that moved enough money to represent 10% of the global economy. But at the same time, this also represented that the tourism sector contributed with 11% of global emissions. And it was in a path, if it wasn't for the pandemic, that would have seen its CO2 emissions rise by 25% by 2030. So if we look at the tourism history, we jump from the 1950s with a few million tourists to 70 years later to have more than 1 billion tourists. So in a way, it's kind of like a party that started to attract a lot of people to a house, then the party grew into the neighboring houses, then the whole street, then the whole neighborhood, then the entire city, the state, and the country. It really got out of control. Then the pandemic came and hit the sector really hard. It stopped everything. 2020 was the worst year in tourism history, and we had a reduction of 74% of international tourists. 100 million jobs was put at risk, and it meant that 1 billion people was not traveling anymore. But in a way, it was also a relief to certain cities and communities worldwide that was suffering from tourism impacts. So now in 2021, with vaccination campaigns in some regions being successful, tourism is picking up again. After months of social isolation and lockdowns, a lot of people are eager to going back to travel. But what the pandemic and the climate change is showing us is that there is a need for behavioral change and to change the forms of mobility as well. So in a way, we can see the exit gate for the pandemic. It's closer and closer, even if we have to live with some of the consequences of this crisis for the years to come. But a bigger and more dangerous crisis is coming. So if we look at the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that was released in August 2021, this is the best knowledge we have about the problem. The future scenarios are not so good. I will spare all the details, but so far what we know is that the planet is 1.1 degree warmer as a result of human activities. And over the next 20 years, global temperatures are expected to surge past 1.5 degrees of warming in every likely mitigation scenario. So the red code for humanity is once again signaling. But are we listening to this, or are we too eager to go back to that life we had where some people could easily travel from one country to another? Well, like I said, some regions that have access to vaccines are opening up again for tourism, and Europe is one example. And this summer, which recorded, by the way, one of the highest temperatures in centuries, we had things like this. So tourists having to evacuate islands in Greece that were on fire, or again, tourists in Turkey facing the same problem, and tourists taking pictures not of a beautiful landscape, but the destruction of it by wildfires. So as it stands, tourism is contributing exactly to this scenario. So I cannot hope for tourism to go back to the same formula as before. And I would argue that even if we try to do it, it wouldn't last for long. We might be heading to a world where we will have more crises that will impact the way we move and the way we travel. So if we look at the possible climate future scenarios in the IPCC report and analyze the regions that might suffer the most from the impacts of climate change, most of these regions are tourism-dependent countries and communities. So one can wonder what lies in the future for places like the Caribbean or winter destinations in Europe, for example. So it's high time to reconsider tourism's paradigm of growth as a measure of success and focus on the transformation of this activity to a sustainable and fair one. So given the complexity of the climate change and the tourism industry, there is a need for global solutions. And here's the moment where I would like to highlight an example that I found during my research and that for me gives me hope for the future of the tourism industry and also to the world. This movement is called the Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency, and it's an organization that was created in 2020 by volunteers from different sectors of the tourism industry, and their aim is to help tourism actors to acknowledge the emergency, so the climate emergency, and to develop climate action plans according to their realities and their possibilities. So far, they already managed to gather around 300 organizations and companies and professionals who have declared a climate emergency and are working to develop climate action plans. They are actively pushing the agenda of tourism and sustainability ahead of the COP26 in Glasgow. And also their work with partners worldwide have resulted in the Declaration of Glasgow, which is a declaration for a commitment of tourism climate action for the next decade. So companies and organizations that want to commit to this, they can sign this declaration and commit to develop a climate action plan within the next 12 months based on key pathways, 5 key pathways. So measurement, decarbonization, regeneration, collaboration and financing. So there's a growing movement to stir tourism into the right track. But I would argue that although the need for reform of tourism is getting more and more attention, there is also the need to recognize that the tourism benefits and its negative impacts are unevenly distributed. And what I mean by that is that the impacts are not the same for everyone. And when we talk about the environment, we are also talking about people. So those who did least to cause the climate crisis are probably the ones who will suffer the most from it. So the pandemic is showing once again that in moments of crisis we have an inequality in the way that the crisis hit different regions in the world. So right now we can look at the global north and see that people can travel again and they can plan their holidays, but the global south is still trapped in the pandemic. So my argument is that reforming tourism should begin by listening and learning from the voices of those who are suffering the most from the impacts of climate crisis and also from the impacts of tourism. Otherwise, we might end up with a reformed version of the way we travel that hasn't really addressed deep-rooted problems of the sector. And I like to see that movements such as the Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency are trying to address these issues. Finally, I'm sure that the desire to travel will always be with us. I, for one, think it would be really sad to get to a point where we cannot travel anymore due to problems of the climate crisis. On a personal level, traveling for studies is probably what brought me here to this moment, to be in front of a camera for a TEDx talk. So I cannot hope for the end of tourism, but I can certainly hope for the end of harmful forms of tourism. We need to recognize that travel and tourism is a space of privilege, and that the desire to connect with other cultures, to visit other places and exchange knowledge cannot come at the expense of the environment and of vulnerable communities. And that's why I believe that actors across the tourism industry should declare a climate emergency, so we can find alternatives for the future where travel can contribute to a more sustainable and fair society.